hopefully everyone had some coffee, and thank you so much. It's been day 2, and I know at this time sometimes things start blurring together, so appreciate everyone for being here and sticking around and being such active participants. So coming up next, we have Michael McTeer, who is a professor at Ulster University, and I've had the pleasure of hearing him speak before and looking forward to hearing what he has to say today. And he'll be speaking about what he wants his chatbot to do. So examining different levels of complexity in the light of user requirements, something that we touched a little bit on the panel before and have talked about over these last 2 days. So welcome to the stage, Michael.
Thank you, Sonia. It's a rather grandiose title. It boils down to something fairly simple. Really, there are different types of chatbot, all sorts of shapes and sizes. We've heard a lot about ChatGPT. It's a very open-ended one. In theory, it answers anything you throw at it, and it's for anybody. Whereas you can have other ones that are for a particular audience. The one that I'll illustrate with is actually for people with fairly mild mental problems. And so that's very specific in what it does, and also in the various technologies that we have used as well. So just looking at what I want to cover, I'll talk very, very briefly about the first topic, the levels of complexity. And then I'll talk about ChatPal. I was interested just before lunch. Catherine talked about ChatPal, actually, so it was nice to see it's already been introduced. And so I'll say a little bit more about it and the background, how we implemented it, and then more specifically the sort of user feedback we've got from when we had user testing subsequent to the development, and then what we've basically learned from that. So there have been various people who've talked about levels of complexity in chatbots, and I feel that it really has several dimensions to it. One is the type of interaction that it supports, which I'll elaborate on each of these presently. Another is the modality or language that's been used. And then a third one is the knowledge or the level of intelligence that it displays. There's probably others, but these are the 3 that I'll focus on. So looking at interaction, ChatGPT actually does more or less the first thing. It's one-shot queries. Well, it does do follow-up as well. And there are lots and lots of systems that do that, but from the point of view of a conversation, that's very simple. It doesn't really try and have a multi-turn conversation like some systems do try to do. Well, then you can have those that are predetermined, where you have a conversation flow that's been designed, and that can work very well, but best really for fairly small type interactions. Once it becomes bigger, then it sort of explodes exponentially, and if you've ever seen some of these graphs, they sort of go totally out of hand. Well, then there are others, and I'm not going to go into those really, but they can rely on different types of technology, and then we get the sort of neural-based ones, like, for example, Google's Lambda, and then the ones that are involved in the Amazon Alexa Social Bot Prize, which aim to chat coherently with you for 20 minutes in order then to achieve the prize that Amazon offer. So there's those different levels of interaction that you might want to support. Then there's whether the system supports system initiative, which our system, as I'll show you, does. ChatGPT is more user initiative. You ask the questions and it finds the answers. And then you can have mixed initiative, which is quite complex and quite difficult to implement. A third degree of the interaction is the degree of personalization. So on both sides, the system can have a persona, which lots of people like to have. Sometimes it's overdone and you don't really like the persona. And then whether it has a model of the user, and that'll come up later actually in my talk. Whether then the system is simply reactive or whether it's proactive as well. So for example, in different types of application, it might want to do reminders about things. That's particularly relevant in various home care type chatbots. And then finally, whether it keeps track of the conversation so that you don't get the sort of thing that it just simply repeats things that were said before, and that it remembers things that have been discussed. Whether that then holds them for subsequent conversations and other days is then again a matter of what people really want. So then looking at modality, well, this is fairly simple, whether you have a text-based one, which our particular example is, whether you have a speech-based one, or whether it's multimodal. As far as the input is concerned, then you can have a very, very simple thing. Again, we were fairly simple. I'll give the reasons later for this, but most of it was based on buttons or quick replies. So then you didn't really have to have an NLU component. We did have, to a very limited degree. You can then have a more sort of constrained input where you have carefully managed prompts that will say, for example, please say yes or no. Even that doesn't always work. One example way back was the question, are you married? And the person said, unfortunately, which presumably means yes. And then you can have others that are specific to a particular domain. So they're going to talk just about sport, for example. And then you can have totally open domain ones like ChatGPT and some of the others. And then from the point of view of the output, it can be predetermined output, which again is the simplest way to do it. You can sometimes have templates where you fill in with variables or with the values of variables that have been filled in during the interaction. Or you can have totally generated from a language model, which we, of course, know all about now. And then finally, the intelligence. Well, again, you can have systems that really don't integrate with anything. They simply just chat. Or you can have those that have some sort of knowledge behind, as Micah was explaining, like a knowledge graph or a database. Or perhaps they scrape stuff off the internet, or it can be generated from a large language model. But of course, beware there, it's not necessarily knowledge that is the source there. And then the tasks can range from all sorts of tasks, simply given a notification, which isn't really all that interactional, simple Q&A, advanced, and so on. So the main sort of idea behind this is, and I think that this is something that somebody mentioned before, is that really when you're wanting to design and develop a chatbot, you have to take into consideration three different things, really. First of all, what your users want and feel they need. And so in this particular project, I'll not talk about it today, though, we had a long period of co-design working. It was difficult, mind, because it was during the COVID period, but we had semi-structured interviews and living labs and various things like that in order to elicit the user requirements and see what they might actually want. And then you have what the stakeholders, so in our case we had stakeholders like the carers within the health service, what they sort of feel would be appropriate, so from the professional point of view. And then finally, you have what the technology can actually do in the light of those. And there can be quite a conflict between those different things, and we'll see some of this as we go on. So very, very briefly, ChatPal, as I say, it was introduced before. It was a research project funded by the European Union, but within a particular program that is designed for the sort of extremities of the European Union. So Northern Europe, we had partners from Finland and Sweden. Initially, we'd hoped to get Iceland as well, but that didn't work out. Then we had the Western Isles of Scotland, Stornoway, and then we had Northern Ireland, and then the Republic of Ireland. We had the people who did the development work actually at Munster University in Cork. The unfortunate thing now is we'll not be able to continue this because Brexit has ruled the Scottish and the Northern Irish out of the equation at the moment, unless things change fairly dramatically. Now, the interesting thing is this was multilingual, but that was again very much a challenge. because, well, we had English, which was okay, but then we had Finnish, which is less, more a low sort of resource language, Swedish, and then Scottish Gaelic even more so, which partly explains why we didn't have any voice in it, because that was going to be a major challenge, really, to have voice-based system in Scottish Gaelic. But then that raised some other sort of implications, which I'll come back to later. So as I say, with extensive requirements gathering, and I'll not actually say anything about that today. Now, unlike some of the other systems like WOBOT and WISA and various other ones in the mental health sort of domain, we didn't aim to do actual diagnosis or screening. That was sort of beyond what we felt that we were willing to achieve. We did have to go through an awful lot of ethics and so on as well. That's part of any European project at the moment. And then also within the university, we have an ethics committee. So those sort of things would probably have got ruled out right from the start, and we wouldn't have been allowed to proceed. So the main aim was to actually promote mental well-being. And we used a particular theory from positive psychology, which I don't really know all that much about. It's called PERMA, but it's promoting positive emotions, engagement, relationships, meaning, accomplishment, and health. And so a lot of it was fairly instructional, as you'll see from the next slide. People were offered a choice as to which particular topic they wanted to hear about, and then they engaged in an interaction about that. But the system more or less told them things, and then they could follow up. There was an element where they could log things about their state, and that was maintained then in a database, but not actually used then by the system subsequently. We didn't really have the resource to go into that. And there were things also like gratitude and thoughts diaries. And although we didn't have the chatbot actually do anything with those, people actually did find those to be fairly beneficial to their mental well-being. And so the development was done through RASA, which I think most people know about. Just very, very briefly, we had the front end, which runs on Android and iOS. And I think, as Catherine mentioned before lunch, you can actually download it. So if you go to the Chatpal site, you can download it and play around with it. And then RASA was the sort of core for implementing the actual interaction and the various aspects of that. And then there was a data store as well, using Amazon AWS. So there's just a very simple example of the interaction. So you can see the system is just prompting, basically, for what the person would like to learn about next, and they have a choice. They could, in theory, type in a message, but we didn't put a lot of effort into developing intent recognition from user input. And so if it happened to match pretty much the intent that it was supposed to, then that would work okay. But to a large extent, it would result in, sorry, I don't understand that, and some sort of remedy then. Now, as I say, we offered 4 different languages, so this actually would have been at the very beginning, after the onboarding, and it then actually, if you chose Scottish Gaelic, it would go into a Scottish Gaelic. I'm not sure if anybody here understands Scottish Gaelic. I don't actually either, but it seemed to work quite well. So moving on fairly quickly, at the design stage, we developed this horrendous dialogue tree, which looks like a recipe for disaster. But in RASA, you can actually split all of that up into little subtrees or subflows, whatever you want to call them, which are then called stories, and they're little snippets of interaction. And so we actually had 500 stories, and to actually get into a story, you would have an input which would be classified as an intent, which would then map into one of the stories. Again, that sounds like possibly a little bit problematic. We had about 180 intents, and some of those would simply be the buttons that people pressed. So that was fairly reliable from the understanding, but which story they went into could be problematic, but it did seem to work fairly well. And each, as I say, each of these intents was interpreted as part of a story. So the main thing then I want to talk about today, and there's a paper that was published there fairly recently that referenced there at the bottom, was the evaluation. And so we had this evaluation, which was a 12-week period, where we wanted to establish the effect that the system had. That was going to be one of the important things, really. And then if there are any sort of differences between the subjects according to the effect. And so we measured the well-being then of people at baseline after 6 weeks and then after 12 weeks of usage of the system. These were sort of tests that we used. I don't know an awful lot about that, but you can sort of see that there was a slight increase in each of the scales there over time. It wasn't statistically significant, but it showed some sort of improvement over time. But there was a lot of variation between the different users, which I'll come to in a minute. The sort of subjective aspect of it was what the people actually felt themselves. So in this case, we had 98 people, and roughly half of them were fairly happy, some very happy, and then there were quite a lot that were sort of fairly neutral, and then just 3 or 4 at the bottom of the thing that didn't really think it helped them at all. Quite interesting then was the qualitative feedback that we got from the users, and that was divided into positive, fairly mixed or neutral, and then actually negative. And there was a lot of detailed analysis, too much to summarize here, but I'll just show you a little bit about that. So of the positive, people liked these different exercises and activities and so on, and the gratitude diary, and they said they'd like to have had a little bit more about reminders. For the mixed ones, some problems with the navigation and the menus and so on at the beginning, but that did settle down. There were concerns about data and privacy, which we did address, but people nevertheless still had concerns. And some of them would have liked a more general chat facility, which we're actually trying to do in a different project that I'll not be talking about here today. And then there were issues with the Scottish Gaelic, which I'll elaborate on towards the end. And then there was some people who actually had negative experiences. There were difficulties from the technical point of view at times. The system wasn't totally robust, and so depending on just how good you were at sort of getting around those, some people obviously had difficulties. Sometimes the response rates were a bit low, depending on latencies and so on, and some people just found it generally difficult to use. But I mean, that depends really on the users to some extent. So looking at some of the implications, some of the users thought it would be good if we actually had a sort of a gender difference, but the problem there would be, of course, that how do you actually do that? I mean, if you start to say, right, this is one for females and this is one for males and so on, there's going to be somebody who's not going to like that as well. But anyway, that's one particular problem. Other people wanted to have more of a conversation history so that if you discuss certain things, it would know that and wouldn't then sort of just offer it up to you again. But you can see that technically that gets to be more of a problem. Your menus then have to be dynamic and updated and so on. And they'd like to have, some others would like to have had more of a persona for the system. Others wanted more adaptivity, so again, that's technically more challenging. It was beyond really what we had the resource to do. And the Scottish Gaelic, now that was more where we needed a good linguist involved, because it was a text-based system, but most people with Scottish Gaelic hadn't actually seen Scottish Gaelic much in writing, apart from street signs maybe, and so they sort of found it a bit odd. It didn't really gel quite for them as sort of authentic, and so that was a bit of a problem. And the sort of things they would discuss with their medics in Scottish Gaelic seemed to have different terminology from what the chatbot was actually presenting. So the user characteristics, it was interesting that the younger users were actually better acquainted with it, and we've come to this particular term called generation mute, where young people don't actually use a phone to talk into, they use it to text into. And because ours was a text-based system, that seemed to suit them. Ones who were older didn't seem to like that quite so much. And then, of course, there's just personalities, those who wish to persevere through initial difficulties. as opposed to those who give up at the first hurdle, really. So that can have a big effect then, really, on the evaluation. So the lessons learned then fairly quickly, I seem I'm right out of time now, that you have different levels of complexity. Ours was fairly simple technically. User involvement is very important. Users can be inconsistent. A lot of them wanted things that actually went against privacy and so on, and so that's problematic, and they have expectations from Alexa and Google Home and so on that we maybe weren't able to meet with our limited resources. And then finally, a lot of them really wanted a more personal approach, but we weren't necessarily able to offer that. I'll just advertise a conference that's coming up. Sorry, I need to go back to that. In June in Belfast. You're all very welcome if you would like to come to that. That's actually associated with a similar project called Men Here. So thank you very much.